Welcome back to my channel. I'm DG Wiggins, and today I'm doing a writing review of the book I just finished reading, Stuff and Nonsense, Volume 1 in the Threadbare series by Seiple. If you're new to my channel, in this type of video I'm going to talk a bit about the lessons learned and thoughts that I had with regards to the writing in a book that I have just listened to or read. And the idea here is to try and pick up a few tidbits that I can incorporate into my own writing. In this book, we follow a main character that is a teddy bear, who in chapter 1 gets animated and brought to life for the first time. I should say up front, I don't intentionally try and filter myself, so there might be some spoilers, there might not be. But if you're sensitive to that, then go read the book and then come back. What intrigued me about this book was that the main character is effectively non-human. You know, it's an object that comes to life. And a lot of my own writing in the past has delved into this kind of concept where your main character is inhuman and you have to describe their inhuman tendencies. And so I was really intrigued by that concept, and that's why I picked it up in the first place. One of the first things I want to talk about in this review is the concept of explaining to the reader early on in the book how the world works, and effectively explaining how the main character learns to live. In chapter 1, as I mentioned, we're starting with an inanimate, dead teddy bear, and then he comes to life and he's effectively dumb. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know what's life, what are these systems, who's this person in the room, what's the cat, things like that. And so he's got to kind of, through trial and error, like a baby, learn what this world is like. One thought that I had while reading these chapters is that Andrew explains these concepts really well. Part of this is helped by the fact that he's writing in a third-person point of view. We've got sort of this narrator going through explaining what's going on in the bear's head, what's he thinking, what's he going to try, what are the results. It feels kind of like a cross between sort of Paddington Bear and Skyrim. Skyrim being the world and the sort of game systems in place, because this is a lit RPG genre type book, which we'll talk about later. But we've got a main character that can't talk, and he's a bear. He's animated, but he's kind of learning through trial and error everything that he does. And it kind of feels like if you've ever had a pet. The pet comes into your home for the first time, be it an adoption or a kitten or a puppy, and they try something, and you either say, no bad dog, or you reward them with a treat. And if they get a treat, then they want to continue to do that. You see this with the main character as almost a plot device. A lot of bad things down the road are checked off by decisions that he makes up front, unknowing, ill-informed of their consequences. And it's just because at the time he was rewarded, and yet he didn't know the long-term consequences of what he was doing. And so that kind of concept was really well played out, I feel. What that effectively did for the reader was that we're able to follow along with this teddy bear as he learns and grows, and effectively become endeared to that character. Also, we learn how the world works through his eyes, which kind of ties us to that character. And throughout the book, we become personally, emotionally invested in that character's progression as they learn and grow and sort of level up. And so that really worked well as a hook for the reader. This wasn't a terribly long book as far as I've been going through lately. And so having that early hook that got me emotionally invested in the character's well-being was really useful. I talked a little bit about this concept in my previous review of Forging Hephaestus, the concept of having a framework where your characters are learning and growing. In Forging Hephaestus, we had essentially a school or a training program in place. This was a little bit more free form, but the idea that the characters are learning and progressing and figuring out the world really helps the readers to become immersed in that world. And so again, I'm finding another example of a book that applies this well, I think, at least in its own way, to kind of help the readers understand the world rather than just telling them this is how the world works. Another novelty or somewhat different tack that this book takes is to have a silent main character. This teddy bear doesn't have a workable mouth. It's just, his mouth is just sort of a sewn line. A lot of the things that he learns to do and observes other people doing involve speaking, and yet he can't do that. And that is something that really appealed to me as well, because I've also tried to write a piece of fiction of my own that had these concepts. In the second NaNoWriMo that I participated in, I had basically a warlock who had captured himself within his own skull and then burned away everything else. So he's just this skull, this spirit stuck in a skull, observing the world. He can't talk to anybody else. And the problems that I saw in my own writing during that time was, one, I was writing in a first-person point of view, so I didn't have the benefit of being able to explain what was in the heads of everybody else and really focus on sort of that outside-looking-in perspective that helps explain what's going on in the world. My warlock stuck in his skull didn't exactly have great senses of everything else around him. The other thing that really hindered me was that having your main character stuck in a completely inanimate object, like a skull, I mean, the skull couldn't move or anything at the time that I was writing it, that completely nullifies or zeroes out any character interactions that you're going to have. With Threadbare, you've got this animated sort of Paddington bear, Winnie the Pooh, teddy bear, not talking, but interacting, hugging, fighting. There's a lot that the reader can derive out of that, which I didn't have when I was trying to write my own warlock story. Also, the fact that my warlock in a skull couldn't move on his own. He was an object. He was a thing to be picked up. Threadbare spends a good portion of this book being picked up and moved from place to place, but there are times when he gets out on his own and can really develop and go and he can walk, he can move, he can do stuff. Eventually he has to learn to do that. So reading this in contrast to that experience, that personal experience of mine, really helps me kind of think about what didn't work in that writing. And so that was really helpful for me personally. I think that going back, if I were to do the warlock story, I might want to apply some of those things, and maybe that would change the nature of the story I was trying to write quite a bit, but at least get a different point of view for the narration, and enable my main character to interact with other characters would have helped a lot. And because that's really highlighted with Threadbare. Threadbare's emotions, his sort of the actions that he takes to just be cute and endear himself to other characters in the story, really motivates or really drives the plot along and helps him grow and find opportunities to grow. The other thing that really helped in the sense of having a silent main character that worked was that Threadbare is a teddy bear. So if he was a human, it would have still worked. But being a teddy bear is sort of this abstract concept that's easier to imagine. There's a lot of variation in humans, could be tall, short, male, female. There's a lot of stuff that goes into that. In this, we have a teddy bear that was effectively born yesterday. This teddy bear can be easily imagined, and so with all of his movements and interactions with other characters, you can easily imagine that. Based off of, and most of us have owned a teddy bear at one point, and so we can think of that and imagine that and play it out in our minds really easily, and that helps the reader, I think, to again become endeared to the character, follow along what's going on, and also see a lot of cause and effect. When the teddy bear does this, then people react in a certain way. So I think that's another thing that helped in this situation quite a bit. Jumping to probably the biggest novelty in this book, and maybe this is a thing. I mean, to be honest, this is the first time I've read a lit RPG genre type book, and I wasn't expecting that. When I picked up the book through Audible and read through the description, I was not expecting to have a lot of the lit RPG elements involved. At the time, I didn't know what those were. So after a quick Wikipedia search, I discovered that this is actually a thing. It's got a niche market to it. Gamers and just kind of people who have been involved in gaming situations, Dungeons and Dragons, MMORPGs, just roleplay games in general, apparently have found a way to incorporate roleplay games and their stat systems into literary works, essentially. And one defining characteristic, according to Wikipedia, is that throughout the book, you, the reader, you are told what are people's stats and abilities, just like you're reading a character sheet in a Dungeons and Dragons-esque sort of game. This was, to be honest, after chapter 1 or chapter 2, kind of irritating. It was obtrusive for me, not knowing that that's what I was going to be getting. As a gamer, I understood it. I knew what they were talking about, and I thought, oh, this is kind of novel, but it was happening every other sentence, it seemed, at times. Oh, Threadbare blinked, agility +1 or dexterity +1, all of these sort of inserted stat updates into the book I'm trying to read and enjoy became obtrusive, to be honest, despite my knowing what they were. As the book went on, they were still very much there, very much involved, and actually played a part in the plot, in the development, in the story world. But they did sort of thin out, I'll say, a little bit, though not terribly much. There was no chapter that I can recall where they were not present. And so that's something that I think you're either going to like or you're either not going to like. And as a writer, I need to understand what kind of audience I'm marketing to or writing for, because if they're not into that, that's going to be quite an acquired taste, I think. On the same token, having those stat systems made it really obvious to the reader where characters were progressing. It came out in kind of bold letters every time that a character was getting better at doing something. It also sort of set up a system for how the world works, and at the end, once you've kind of wrapped your head around that system and thought about how things would work, it became sort of like a game, in a sense, in that you can sort of insert yourself and say, what kind of decisions would I make? What skills and abilities would I focus on? It also, there's just the RPG concept in itself puts you in a mind frame that is very interesting, because it's different from our own world. And there's one character in this book at one point in a scene, he's talking to his daughter, and he's explaining how the world would have been if these systems weren't in place. In this world, if you're off kissing your girlfriend and then suddenly you get a charisma +1, and everybody kind of realizes that you were a bad kisser before, everything's very transparent. That's maybe not the best example, but the idea is that you have a numerical system that tells characters, individuals, and sometimes everybody else when you're getting better at things or how good you are at things. Everything is very comparable. There's nothing subjective. If you have one baker and another baker, and one has a baking skill of 200 and another one has a baking skill of 5, then you know that the 200 skill baker is a lot better than the other one. And that kind of brings up an interesting sort of social dilemma to think about in terms of the story and any other stories that you'd want to write in that world, because you've got to take into consideration that people are kind of wearing their abilities. So people or characters are more encouraged to kind of focus on self-development. In the real world, in today's world, there's a lot of people who will try and get by through cons or just good marketing. Rather than writing a good book, I'm just going to market it really well. Or rather than working on my self and my personality, my social skills, etc., I'm just going to look amazing and then go on lots of dates. The real world is very different in that sense. Whereas in this world, characters have that gamified mentality, and they understand that they might be at level X in a certain skill, and if they want to get better at it, then they're going to have to work at it, and they kind of understand that that's their reality. That mechanic changes a lot of how characters interact with one another, and it's an integral part of their daily life, which was really novel for me as a reader to sort of look into this world and see how that would work. It's a lot like if you've ever read a book that just changes, maybe it's contemporary fiction where they've changed one aspect of the world that fundamentally changed everything, introduced werewolves or gave certain people superpowers, things like that. But it was much more subtle than that, because yeah, that you've got some characters that seem to have superpowers at times, but it's all built into this system. I don't know how to necessarily incorporate that into my own writing. For me personally, as I mentioned, this is my first time reading a lit RPG. I have done a review in the past on Mogworld, which was more of a game lit, according to Wikipedia, and in that we didn't have all of the stats necessarily incorporated into the story, but it was still a story of characters in a game world, similar to an MMO. But this hasn't been sort of my area of writing in the past, and so I don't know that I would focus entirely on this. But if I were to go and write a piece of lit RPG, I would wonder if there's a way to incorporate the RPG elements without them being so obtrusive, because it did wear on me as a reader. I mean, frankly, at the end, the epilogue was just a stat sheet of this is where Threadbare is, and here's all the stats that he's learned, and it was just kind of dry, and I was hoping for a bit more story in that bit. So I don't know what the right answer to that is. How if there is a literary writerly mechanic to sort of make all the stats or the presence of stats less obtrusive, and yet at the same time in this book they were fundamental to the story. They were fundamental to how did Threadbare come to be, why is he the way he is, and what's his purpose in life. Last thing I wanted to talk about was the ending, and without necessarily spoiling the ending, hopefully, we'll see. It's obvious when you get to the ending that he is setting up for a sequel. Now, I did mention this is volume 1 or book 1 in a series, and I think there's an art to doing this well. A lot of books, they kind of get to the end and then they sort of throw out to the reader, oh, by the way, there's all of these hanging, dangling plot threads. Or maybe they wrap it up, and then like in a lot of the sort of action superhero movies that we see today, after the credits they show some scene of new supervillains getting together and plotting for their next thing. In this book, in the Threadbare series, we kind of get to the end. We're kind of in a lull in the action. We've just had this big climax where the girl is put in danger, and the Threadbare gets himself a quest. He's got to go save her, and then he's kind of pinned down, and everything sort of stops, where Threadbare is basically kind of hanging, trying to catch up to everybody else. You don't know what's happened to certain characters. Did they die? Did they not? Where did they go? And it's sort of nothing really sort of wraps up. There isn't a lot of resolution to it, which is great for planning another sequel. But on the same token, if you went into this, if you picked up the book and you didn't register that, oh, this is book 1 of a series, some series are more, I want to say, episodic, where you can get done with an episode or a book and put it down for a while. And that's really helpful, particularly if the series is still being written, because it's sort of wrapped up and you don't have that feeling of missing satisfaction, I guess, for having finished reading the book. You're not going to get any of that in this book. You get done with this book, and luckily the next book has already been published and it's out and available. But I got done with this book and I felt like, well, I gotta find out what's new, what's going on after this, what happens, what's the end of the story, because I really didn't feel like I got that in this story. So I wasn't entirely thrilled about that. I'm not entirely against it, but I did feel like it could have been better well communicated, and I don't know the answer to that either, whether that is on the publishers or the distributors or marketing. Somehow I, as a reader, as a consumer, would like to know upfront when I'm buying the book, is this something that is one book worth of reader investment time, or am I going to get to the end of this book and in order to get the end of the story, I have to get the other books? That I would have liked to know up front somehow. And maybe there's an attempt or an effort to do that, but it was lost on me. So I don't know what the answer to that is. The thing that I think this story or this book did really well, that really stood out to me in terms of writing, was at the end of the story we take our mute teddy bear who hasn't said a word all book. And he manages to give himself the ability to speak. You know, he pulls out his tailoring scissors, cuts a hole in his teddy bear mouth, and eventually crafts a mouth for himself. And for the first time says something at the very end of the story. That really gripped me. So the lesson learned from that, I think, is that as an author, as a story crafter, if you're going to have a sequel and you're going to leave things off, what really grips the reader is giving your main character a new ability. Because the thought of what is Threadbare going to do with this, it really, that captivated me more than anything else. I really liked that. And so that's something that I think, should I in the future write something that's going to be episodic and have a follow-up, or part of a series, I think empowering your main character in some way, some way that allows the reader to start to speculate to what he might do, is a really great way to end the story. Whether or not you necessarily outline all the other plot threads that are left hanging, I think is, like I said, it's an art. I think getting it right, tweaking it enough so that readers kind of feel satisfied for reading the book but still want to read more, and that is one way to end a book that's going into a sequel. But this other way that I felt in empowering your character really worked well. So I really liked that. I think that I'm going to go and get the next installment in this series. I don't know if I'm going to do a whole writing review. We'll see. We'll see what I learned from reading the book. But I don't know if I'm going to do another video on that one as well. But it was enough that I enjoyed the book enough, and I'm engaged enough with Threadbare, the character, that I want to see what he does with this new speech ability. So that's all I had to talk about on this book. If you enjoyed the video, leave a thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy the video, leave a thumbs down. Comment, share, subscribe, etc., etc. Check out the description below this video for links, and I will see you all next time in another video.